Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Alana. I'm the Restore Program Manager at Zero Foodprint. And also on this call is Jami Witek, who runs our Compost Connector program, and our program manager, Katya, who's going to be helping with our slides and questions today. So we have two grant programs that we're going to be covering on the call today. I'm going to present about our Restore grant program for about 25 minutes. And then Jami will present on our Compost Connector program for about 20 minutes. And then hopefully we should have plenty of time at the end for everyone's questions. So as we said, feel free to pop those in the Q&A feature at the bottom, just throughout as questions arise. But if you can, please specify which program they're for. If it's a question for Restore or a question for Compost Connector, that'll help us know how to answer it. And then we'll get to all those at the end, like we said. But before I jump into presenting on the grants, I'm just going to give a quick overview of our organization, Zero Foodprint. So next slide, thank you. We are primarily an environmental organization, and we like to say that we are working to change the way food is grown in order to restore the climate. So we raise funds from a variety of sources. We have member businesses who donate a portion of sales, but we also fundraise from individuals. And recently we've gotten some private grants. And then we basically pool all those funds and we redistribute it as grants to farmers to implement conservation practices on working lands. Next slide. This is kind of just a visual of how that works. Basically, businesses can contribute from anywhere. We have business members all around the country. Many of them are restaurants, cafes, bars, things like that. But really, any type of business can participate. And they contribute a portion of sales. Like I said, it's usually about 1%, but we have different funding structures depending on what works. And then that helps us fund this work. So if you know of a business that might be interested in joining as a member, please, we'd love to hear from you because we're always looking for more ways to grow our impact. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to be talking about our Restore grant program, which is kind of our flagship kind of OG grant program. Next slide. So, since we are a climate organization first and foremost, our grant program is really centered around carbon sequestration. So, I'm going to go more in depth on that later on. But that's kind of what you need to know for now. So, when you apply for the grant, you can apply for up to $25,000 to implement anywhere from 1 to 4 what we call climate smart farming practices of your choosing. So we use the same definitions as the NRCS for their conservation practice standards. And so we have a whole list of approved practices that can be found in the grant guidelines on our website. But just to give you an idea, it's things like compost application, hedgerow establishment, prescribed grazing, cover crops, no-till or reduced till, things like that. So basically practices that are going to have a direct effect on soil organic matter and increasing carbon in your soil. So things like building infrastructure for on-farm produced compost would not be eligible for a grant, but the actual application of compost that would qualify. So we do require that you work with a technical assistance provider, since they will kind of be like a unbiased third party that will sign off at the end that says, yes, everything was completed appropriately. But Zero Foodprint does cover that cost. So we ask you to kind of identify what that cost would be when you apply, since that would be part of what you're awarded. And then if you're selected for a grant, you will have 12 months to implement the scope of work that you applied for. So just keep that in mind as you're putting together your application. You should be aiming for a scope of work that feels realistic for you to achieve in a year's time, because your grant award is really tied to the scope of work that you applied for. So that's just to say, once you've been awarded, the scope of work can't change. And next, I'm going to talk a little bit about eligibility. Great. So the grant is open to anyone who is growing food or beverage for human consumption. So things like fibers or tobacco products would not be eligible. And then we do require property owner approval, and we require you to attest that the practices that you're applying for are additional, meaning that they would not be carried out without this grant funding. And that's really just to keep ourselves honest in our impact reporting, since we want to make sure that, you know, we're contributing to more carbon being stored in the soil than would have been there if we didn't exist as an organization. So if you have questions around whether or not you would be eligible, feel free to ask in the chat or shoot us an email after at grants@zerofoodprint.org. And then as for what grant funds can be used towards, they can be used for any supplies, labor, services, or equipment that are required for the completion of the practices that you were awarded for. Um, just note that if you apply for something that would be a really large expense, like a large equipment purchase or something like that, that might make your grants less competitive since we score projects based on their cost efficiency. Next slide, please. So as I said, we do require awardees to work with a technical assistance provider to validate that practices have been carried out appropriately. And so this person could be an employee of your local RCD, Resource Conservation District, or an NRCS staff member, or it could be someone from a university extension, a member of a nonprofit, or just like a seasoned individual who has had lots of experience providing technical assistance for climate smart ag projects. So if you're wondering if your technical assistance provider would qualify, like the person you've identified would qualify to be your technical assistance provider, or if you're wondering if you qualify, feel free to email after with the resume of the proposed person, and I can let you know. So you will provide the contact information for this person as part of your application, and then you'll also upload a quote from them for the cost of their service for this project. And then also, I just want to say if your technical assistance provider isn't familiar with our program and would like to know more about the reporting requirements before they give a quote, that's totally fine. Happy to provide a little bit more information. If you want to reach out afterwards, we have a TAP manual that kind of goes over the reporting requirements. So happy to send that out to anyone interested. But essentially, your technical assistance provider acts as your resource for any kind of on the ground questions that you have pertaining to practice implementation. And so we really recommend staying in consistent communication with them before and during practice implementation. And then they will likely conduct a site visit at the end and fill out a brief form that basically signs off that everything has been completed. And then that will unlock your final grant payment. So that's it on technical assistance. So scoring boosts. I'm going to go over how we score projects just after this, so don't worry. But essentially, there's two different ways that you can get a boost to your application. The first is if you belong to a historically underserved demographic, which you would self-identify in your application, or if you supply one of our member restaurants or businesses. And that's the directory is linked in the application and it's also found on our website. So either one of these boosts essentially removes 30% from your cost per ton, which again, I'm going to explain what that means in just a second. Or you can receive both boosts. And if you get both, you would get 50% off your cost per ton, which is kind of like how we score projects. So you're getting a discount. I'll explain in a second. Next slide. Okay, so now this is kind of like a peek behind the curtain on how we score projects. And in my mind, this is really the most important part of the presentation. I think it will help you immensely if you're looking to apply for this program. So our scoring process is very quantitative rather than qualitative. It's very much based around the cost per ton of carbon that will be sequestered for each project. So you can kind of think of your cost per ton as like your project's score. And you want as low of a score as possible because that means it's more cost efficient. So we basically competitively rank applicants against each other in a given round and rank them from lowest cost per ton to highest cost per ton. So I'll show you how to find your cost per ton. Essentially, you this way, like this is the calculation here on the slide. And so you can calculate it yourself, but it's also going to be in the application. It will calculate it for you. Actually, okay, wait, can we go back for a second? Thank you. So at the top, we've got the grant project bid. So that is the sum of what you're bidding for each practice, which is up to you because you know best what it would cost to implement one of these practices, like how much it would cost to do composting on however many acres you're planning to apply compost to. So you determine the cost bids, and then we add those all up. And then we also add the cost of technical assistance, which is that quote that you'll get directly from your provider. And then together, those make up the project cost. And then that is then divided by the total carbon sequestered. And to get that, we use an online tool called the Comet Planner, which is linked in the application. And that is basically what projects how much carbon would be sequestered if you were to carry out these practices on however many acreage. So once you know the scope of work that you want to apply for, you will input the practice or practices into Comet to basically estimate the carbon sequestration value. And then we take that number and we multiply it by the practice's lifespan. And we do that on the back end. You don't have to worry about it. But essentially, that gives us the total carbon that will be sequestered across the whole lifespan of the practice. Which again, the grant is the implementation of practices is for 1 year. But if you're planting a tree, that might continue to sequester carbon for 15 years. And so we incorporate all of that carbon into the modeling and into your score. And then essentially, when you divide the cost by the total lifespan of the CO2, that is what gives us this cost per ton of carbon, which is what we use to rank projects. And then we fund projects with the lowest cost per ton since they're the most cost effective. Okay, let's look at some examples. So example number one is a cattle ranch. And as you can see, they're applying for the maximum amount of $25,000 with $2,000 for technical assistance. And they have two practices. So let's say they're range planting and prescribed grazing, for instance. And together, these practices add up to 200 tons of carbon that will be sequestered. So when we do the math, we get $135 per ton. So it's a little on the high end. We wouldn't typically fund a cost per ton that's that high. So let's look at another example. So this is an almond orchard. And as you can see, they're applying for the same amount and they're applying to plant a hedgerow. So they just have one practice, but this practice has a little bit longer of a lifespan. It has a 15-year lifespan. So the total CO2 for this project comes out to 900 tons of carbon. And then just for instance, for example's sake, we're going to say that they're a historically underserved producer. So they're also getting a boost, which is going to reduce their cost per ton by 30%. So at $21 a ton, this second example is a lot more likely to be awarded. So as you can see, it's not really about, what practices you apply for or how much you're bidding, but it's really about this ratio of how much you're bidding to how much you're sequestering. So if your carbon sequestration value is pretty low, then you might consider bidding a little bit less to even out that ratio in your favor. The other thing you can do to help your application is to consider cost sharing a little bit. So next slide, I'm going to go into how that works. So when you cost share, you're basically, again, angling that ratio to lower your cost per ton and improve your score. So on the application, it's very easy to do. You just identify, it will ask for each practice the true cost estimate for carrying out that practice. And then it will also ask what you are bidding from the Restore grant to complete that practice. So you might say, okay, I think it's going to cost $5,000 to apply compost to this many acres, but I'm going to bid $4,000 from Restore. And then I'll put in $1,000. And that cost share can be internal or external. So meaning it could come from you or it could come from another grant. We just ask that you identify the source of the cost share in the application when it asks about cost sharing. And then the only other thing to note here is that cost sharing cannot exceed 2 times the grant bid. So for instance, if your practices add up to a bid of $25,000, you couldn't cost share more than $50,000. And that's just to kind of even the playing field a little bit. And again, to keep ourselves honest in our impact reporting, we want to make sure that we're a primary reason that this project got funded or that this project was able to be carried out. All right, next slide. So now I'm going to go through how to fill out a comment planner because this is something that there's just kind of a learning curve to it. And then once you get it, and it's very simple. So this is what the comment planner looks like. Again, this is the tool that we use to estimate carbon sequestration, and it can be found linked in the application itself. So step 1 is just to select your county, and then you'll select the land type in step 2 under the agricultural system. And then this will open up a list of available practices below. So next slide. There's that list of practices. It's a drop down on the left. And then once you select the one you want, it might ask you a qualifying question on the right side under payment scenario. And sometimes you just need to make sure that little notch is clicked and showing green. And then it will populate the practice below. So next slide. So then this table is where you fill out the acreage or the linear feet that you'll be implementing the practice on. And then this number that's circled on the right, that 46, that is exactly what you'll put into your application when it asks you for the CO2 number. And again, that's just for 1 year, but that's what we're looking for in the application. So you don't have to think about the lifespan, just that number. And then if you're applying for more than one practice, you'll just scroll up and repeat that same process of selecting a practice, filling in more information if necessary, and then coming down to this table and it will populate it and you'll fill in the acreage. And then when you're done, you'll hit download comment planner at the bottom and you'll upload that to your application. And then just note that that estimated payment column on the right side, we don't use that. That is just for other uses of the comment planner. So you can totally disregard that for our program. Again, you determine your cost bid based on your own calculations. So that does not need to factor into your bid or what the amount you apply for. All right, next slide. All right, so if you're looking to apply for compost, this part gets a little bit granular. So I'm going to break it down. Essentially, there are 3 different types of compost that you types of compost application that you can apply for. So the first type is the standard CDFA application rate, meaning if you are looking to apply compost to annual crops, perennial crops, or rangeland at the recommended application rate listed in COMET, which is usually 2 to 4 tons per acre or 6 to 8 tons per acre, depending on the C to N ratio, then you will fill out the COMET planner as I explained above. Um, this is the simplest way to do it, and I think most people applying for compost will probably fall into this category. But there are other options. The second type is the Riles and Silver compost method, which is only for grazing lands, and it is a rate of 15 tons of compost per acre. And there's no option for this in the COMET planner. So if you are looking to apply for this type of compost application, you will not need to put that practice in your COMET planner. We have a totally different way of calculating the sequestration value of this practice. So you will just need to answer how many acres you're looking to do this practice on, and we'll take care of the rest. And then lastly, the third type of compost application is what we call the custom application rate of compost. So for instance, if you're looking to apply 2 tons an acre or 10 tons an acre, those are both outside of the CDFA standard application rate. So again, you would not need to use the COMET planner. Instead, you would use the compost calculator that we've developed that's linked in the application. And you would answer some additional questions about your compost, like the rate of application, of course, the C to N ratio, and the carbon percentage of the compost. And these can all be found on the technical data sheet of the compost, which usually you can get from your compost supplier. Once you know what type of compost you're looking to source, they should be able to provide all that information. But generally, I don't recommend going the route of the custom application rate unless there's a specific ecological reason why you or your technical assistance provider believe this is best for your land. Because it is just a bit more complicated to apply for, and the calculator is a little bit more conservative in its CO2 estimate than COMET. So if you can, I would recommend applying for a CDFA standard application rate. And then if you are applying to restore to spread compost that has been purchased, so not on-farm produced compost, then it must be purchased from a CalRecycle approved facility. And we have a whole list of all the CalRecycle approved facilities, and that's linked in the application, so you can check there, but just something to be aware of. And then I'll also say if you are only looking to apply for compost, you may also be interested in applying to our Compost Connector program, which is what Jami is going to be presenting on after me. So be sure to stick around for that. That's another good option, and you can apply to both Restore and Compost Connector. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. Next slide. So FSA and APN numbers, these are required in the application. Basically, your FSA number is your Farm Service Agency number, and you will only have one if you received government funding in the past. So if you have, you can easily find your number on the fsa.usda.gov website. Otherwise, if you don't have one, you can just leave that blank. And then your APN stands for your assessor parcel number, and everyone should have one. It's for the plot of land that you're farming on where these practices will take place. And in order to find that, you can go to the website of your county assessor's office and type in your address. And if you're looking to implement practices across multiple parcel numbers, that's fine. You can input multiple into your application. And if you have trouble finding these, let us know. Sometimes we can help. All right, next slide. Okay, so next, I just wanted to go over some kind of timelines and dates so you have an idea. Basically, our next window to apply is set to open July of this year, though I will note that the exact timing of that is dependent on available funding. Um, and that will likely run from July through late August. That will be the open window to apply. And then if you're awarded, you'll sign a contract probably around early September, and that will trigger your first grant payment that will enable you to get started on your practices. And then once things are underway, you'll send us a simple progress update form, and we'll send the next payment, which is 30% of your grant. And then at the end, once all practices have been completed, your technical assistance provider will fill out a validation form, and that will unlock your final grant payment. So we don't typically require soil testing, but if soil testing is required for your project, you'll be notified of that in advance in your award letter and in your contract. So essentially, you have a little bit of time before you need to put together your application. So I would recommend starting by reviewing the full list of approved practices, which again can be found at the bottom of our grant guidelines, which is linked on our website. And then starting to think about what practices you might be interested in applying, either adopting or expanding on your farm in the next year or so. And then once you have an idea of what you're interested in applying for, then you can start kind of playing around in the Comet Planner to see, making sure, those practices are available in your area and seeing which ones have a high carbon sequestration value. And then you may also want to reach out to a technical assistance provider and get them on board in advance, since sometimes that can take some time to find a service provider. And then, yeah, once you have your scope of work clearly outlined and your technical assistance provider signed on, then really you should be able to fill out the application in like 20 minutes. We try to keep it pretty simple. I think the hard part is really just figuring out what it is you want to apply for. And that's it for me on Restore. So now I'm going to pass it to Jami to tell you a little bit more about our Compost Connector program. And again, we're going to save those questions till the end, so you'll hear from me more in a little bit. But all right, on to you, Jami.
Thanks so much, Alana. Hi, everyone. I'm Jami Witek. I'm a grants manager at Zero Foodprint, and I'm going to be sharing some information about our Compost Connector program. If some of you are familiar with this program from last year, we have made some changes for 2025. So the program will look a little bit different than it did in 2024. Next slide. So Compost Connector is open to all California growers producing food or beverage products for human consumption. This program offers rebates of between $5 and $15 per ton of compost purchased from facilities on our approved vendors list. I'll get into what that list is in just a bit. But just know that on-farm produced compost or compost from a facility not on our vendors list will not be eligible for a rebate through the program. Compost Connector runs on a yearly basis. So when you're applying now, you are applying for compost that you will be purchasing in 2025. The program will close down at the end of the year and then reopen in 2026, and you would apply again next year for next year's compost purchases. Compost Connector can be used with other grant programs like the Healthy Soils program or EQIP. It can also be used alongside Restore. We just ask that if you are receiving Restore funds for compost, you are not using that funding for the same compost purchase that you would then submit to Compost Connector for a rebate. Next slide. Compost Connector was created in response to California Senate Bill 1383. Some of you may be familiar with SB 1383, but I'm just going to take a couple moments to talk about this legislation and why we saw it as a unique opportunity to create this program. So SB 1383 mandates businesses and governments divert organic matter from landfill. Basically means that everyone needs to compost and everyone needs to use their green bins. Another part of this legislation requires jurisdictions to procure quantities of recycled organic waste products based on their population. So compost is one of these recycled organic waste products. So we saw an opportunity to work with jurisdictions who needed assistance in meeting their procurement targets and providing that funding to growers who are interested in purchasing compost. So this is why the compost you purchase has to come from a facility on our approved vendors list. These are facilities pulled from CalRecycle's Swiss list of permitted or notification status composting facilities. These facilities are selling SB 1383 compliant compost. Next slide. If you're new to purchasing compost or you want to see if the vendor you've purchased from before is eligible for our program, we do have this resource. Doesn't say it on here, but this is compost.ag. You can come to this website and put in your address, and you will see a map view showing facilities in your area that are eligible for our program. You will also be asked, like when you're in the program, to select the facility you plan to purchase from, and there is a spreadsheet view that you will also see that lists all the facilities that work for Compost Connector. All right, next slide. So if you're interested in applying, it is very simple. You start by filling out an intake form at zerofoodprint.org/compost. It just asks a couple of questions about your contact information, where you're located, and then how much compost you plan to purchase in 2025. Next, you will be sent a Compost Connector agreement through DocuSign. And it's really important that you sign this agreement prior to any compost purchase you make that you want to submit to the program for a rebate. We aren't able to provide rebates on compost purchased before you've entered into the Compost Connector program. Once you've signed your agreement, within about a week, you will receive a link to log into the Compost Connector portal. And this is the space where you can start a claim and reserve rebate credits. I will talk about this a little bit more in just a moment. But just a note on our claims, we do have a 1,000-ton limit per claim and a 20,000 per year maximum per grower. Another thing to note that once you're in the portal, if funding isn't available, we suggest that you continue to check back to the portal, maybe in a week or two or a month later. We do continue to partner up with jurisdictions throughout the year. And then any grower funding that doesn't get used does go back into the general fund. Next slide. So this is what it looks like once you're in the claim portal. You want to come here when you're about to purchase your compost. And you will start out by creating a claim. That's that button here on the left, that circle. And then once you click that, it will pop up this form on the right. And this is where you can search for available funding and reserve what we call rebate credits. So basically down here at the bottom, you would click Find. If we have available funding, a screen will pop up with that funding amount. And basically the funding is a rebate that you will receive per ton or cubic yard of compost that you purchase. So it will be a dollar amount per ton or per yard. As I mentioned, if no credit value comes up, then it just means the program doesn't currently have any funding, and you can continue to check back down the line to see if more funding does become available. Assuming there is funding, then you will go ahead and reserve the amount of rebate credits, meaning the amount of compost you plan to purchase in the next 30 days. And then you would click Submit, and then your claim is created. Next slide. If you're interested in sort of figuring out what your rebate will be before you make your purchase, the funding you receive is based on the amount of compost that you purchase. So the amount of compost as reflected on your invoice times your credit value at the time of your claim creation will be your rebate. Again, if there are no rebate credits available, just continue to check the portal for additional funding. Next slide. So here's just a couple of examples. If you reserve 500 rebate credits at $10 a ton and you go out and purchase 500 tons, then your rebate would be $5,000, 500 tons times $10 a ton. In this second example, if you reserve 500 rebate credits, but then you only end up purchasing 400 tons, your rebate is $4,000. The 400 tons you purchase times $10 a ton. So it doesn't benefit you to reserve more rebate credits than the amount of compost you plan to purchase in the next month, because any unused funding is just going to go back to the general fund available to all growers. Next slide. So once your rebate is secured, you then have 30 days to make your compost purchase and upload your documentation. I'll show some examples of what that looks like and then what documentation is required in just a minute. But just a few notes. If your vendor sells in cubic yards, that's totally fine. We use a 1 ton to 2.5 cubic yard ratio. The funding amounts are the same. We just calculate it based on whether you buy in yards or tons. And as I mentioned, your reimbursement is calculated on the amount of compost you actually purchase as reflected on the invoices you upload into your claim form. And just something I want to note, we recognize that in most cases, our funding is not going to cover the full cost of your compost, especially when you factor in delivery and spreading and the material itself. We know compost is very expensive to use. We just hope that Compost Connector helps offset some of those high costs associated with using compost. Next slide. So once you've made your purchase and you have all the required documentation, you're going to return to the portal and click on your claim and upload the required documentation and answer a few questions, and then you would submit your claim to us for review. Next slide. So here's a list of the documentation that you will be required to upload into your claim in order to receive your rebate. The first are 2 geotagged photos showing the compost delivery and spreading. If you don't plan to spread right away, that's fine. We just want to see that the compost made its way to you. So it can be photos of a truck delivering the compost. It can be photos of big piles of dirt. They don't need to be pretty photos. They just need to show that you received the compost you purchased. We ask a couple of questions about practice standards, crop types, acreage, things like that. You will be asked to upload a W-9 form. You will also be asked some questions about your preferred payment method. We find that most growers prefer to receive a direct deposit. You can receive your funding then in about 2 weeks after your claim has been approved. A check deposit or a check in the mail can sometimes take 6 weeks or longer. If you do choose direct deposit, you will be asked to upload either a voided check or a direct deposit authorization form. We also ask for a technical data sheet. This is something your facility will provide you with, and it is just testing that's done on the compost product that you've purchased. And finally, we ask for the invoice from the facility on our approved vendors list. The invoice does require we need to see a couple of things on the invoice in order to approve it for a rebate. So if you go to the next slide, I'll be able to go through that in more detail. All right, so here is an example of an invoice from a totally made up compost facility and a fake customer, but it has all of the required elements that we will need to see on an invoice in order for your rebate to be approved. All right, I'm gonna have you click to the next part. All right, so first, the compost must be on the letterhead from a facility on our approved list. So a invoice from a trucking company or a spreading company or from a facility that is not matching what's on our list will not be approved for a rebate. Next. The date of the invoice needs to be on or after the date that you signed your Compost Connector agreement. Again, we cannot retroactively provide rebates on compost before that signed agreement date. Next. The delivery address needs to match the property address listed on your application. We just need to know that the compost went to where you said it would go. Next. And then Zero Foodprint needs to be printed somewhere on the invoice. So just ask your facility to include our organization's name somewhere. It can be in the PO field, in the notes field, it can be in the description. It can't be handwritten by you after the fact, but we just want to see that the invoice that you submitted is associated with our program and received funding through us. Next. And then the final thing is that we want to see that the word compost is in the description field. That's what you've purchased. We need to see the quantity that you've purchased and then whether it was purchased in tons or cubic yards. That way we know how to calculate your rebate. So once you've uploaded all of this documentation and submitted your claim, our team will review. And assuming that everything checks out, then we will send you your rebate in the method that you requested in your claim form. And then you are welcome if you plan to purchase compost later on in the year. You can return to the portal and start a new claim, reserve more rebate credits, and start the process all over again. Again, you can do this as many times as you'd like throughout the year, up to a $20,000 maximum per grower. And as I mentioned before, when you are reserving credits, you will be maxed out at 1,000 credits per claim. All right, next slide. So that is the Compost Connector program. We've given you lots of information about both of them. Just gonna highlight some of the top level stuff about each program. For Restore, the award schedule is a 50% payment upfront, a 30% payment midway through once you've submitted a progress report, and then 20% at the end once you've implemented your practices and have your technical service provider sign off on them. For Compost Connector, you will receive your funding once you've submitted your documentation and it's been reviewed and approved by our team. Eligible practices for Restore are all NRCS practices in Comet. For Compost Connector, it is compost purchased from vendors on our approved vendors list. Once awarded, Restore, you will have 1 year to implement your practices. Compost Connector, once you've created a claim, you have 30 days to purchase and upload your documentation. For funding, Restore offers awards of up to $25,000. Compost Connector provides rebates of up to $15 per ton. The rebate amount is really based on the available program funding at any given time. You can reapply to both programs. Restore does have a lifetime maximum of $75,000. Compost Connector you can use as many times as you'd like throughout the year, up to that $20,000 maximum. Both programs are stackable with other grants. If you plan to apply to both Restore and Compost Connector, just keep in mind that you can't use funding for both programs for the same compost purchase. And then finally, if you have any questions about Restore, you can contact Alana at grants@zerofoodprint.org. And any questions about Compost Connector, you can contact me at compost@zerofoodprint.org. Um, so next slide. That sort of concludes our presentation on the programs. We'll get into our questions and answers portion. I haven't checked the chat, so I don't know how things are looking in there, but I think as Alana mentioned, if you are directing it, like if you're putting a question in the chat, can you just mention which program you are directing that question towards? And yeah, Katya is going to help us out here by sort of keeping an eye on the chat and reading out any questions that come up.
Awesome. Yeah, let's just go in order from the first ones that came in to the most recent. So the very first one is, we produce organic alfalfa for the organic dairy industry. Would we be able to get this grant? I believe that's for the Restore grant.
So yes, since you are producing food for um, animals that are then producing milk that will go into the food chain, supply chain, that counts as producing beverage for human consumption. So yes, you are eligible.
Awesome. Deborah Harris wants to know, I oversee many Head Start school gardens, and I'd be looking at small projects at many garden sites. Is this something that might be considered for Restore?
Yeah, we get variations of this question a lot, which is basically can very small plots or community garden plots apply? The answer is yes, absolutely. We've definitely awarded grants to very small acreages of land. I will just say that smaller acreages sometimes have a harder time producing a scope of work that has a high carbon sequestration value. So oftentimes when they're awarded, it is for a smaller sized grant. So I didn't mention this, but the smallest possible award is $1,500. So you might want to think about, scaling creating a scope of work that matches or matching what you're bidding to what you are able to sequester as part of your scope of work. And typically, I'd say the practices that tend to do well on smaller plots of land are things that involve woody biomass planting. So things like hedgerow establishment or windbreaks or things like that, more so than something like mulching or composting, which I think usually benefit from kind of larger scale.
Awesome. Nicola is asking, is there any funding available for specifically compost producing organizations?
So, as I said, it's more so about the compost application than it is the compost production, since it's the application that's then going to, you know, improve soil organic matter and microbial activity and things like that. And that's really what we're after in our funding for Restore. So, it's not to say it's not possible, but I would say you would probably want to partner with a farm that is taking your compost and actually applying it. And maybe they're awarded to purchase compost from you or something like that. I think there's kind of some ways you could get creative.
Cool. Thank you. Can you please define the underserved farmers for this grant?
Yeah, absolutely. So we borrow the same definition from the NRCS for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And so their definition is an individual or entity who is a member of a socially disadvantaged group. A socially disadvantaged group is a group whose members have been subject to racial or ethnic prejudice because of their identity as members of a group without regard to their individual qualities. So some examples are American Indians or Alaskan Natives, Asians, Blacks or African Americans, Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders, and Hispanics. And then they, as well as we, require at least 50% ownership of the farm business to be held by that socially disadvantaged individual in order to qualify for that boost.
Awesome. Thank you. I was trying to write all that down, but I think that if we could just find a link.
Yes, we can find a link.
Okay, great. Um, So Carol wants to know, is there any advantage to being an over 75 white female? Is there any disadvantage to having a small orchard, 1.5 acres, 200 trees, mostly young? She's planning on applying for hedgerows and compost.
I'd say there's no advantage to being an over 75 white female. It will ask, so female is a historically underserved, though not a socially disadvantaged. So we do ask that, though it's not part of the boost. And then no disadvantage to having a small orchard. I think that all sounds like a excellent, great candidate for funding through Restore.
Awesome. So Desiree is asking, would nonprofits who oversee a community garden be considered for these programs? I think you
Yes. Yeah,
earlier.
yeah. But I'll just add to it and say nonprofits of all kinds are absolutely eligible to apply to Restore. And again, you're able to apply for multiple plots of land if that makes sense. If you want to try to kind of add up acreage to make a larger project, you're absolutely able to do that and kind of roll up different plots into one larger project.
Awesome. Can the compost connector program be used to buy mulch to be used in orchards to improve water soil retention?
So compost, while mulch is considered a recycled organic waste product for SB 1383 procurement, our program focuses specifically on compost. So unfortunately, mulch would not be covered under the program.
We have a question from Alex, which says, does the Restore grant allow for aid in purchasing compost equipment? And I think you touched on this earlier, but small equipment, you might be able to pay for it, but you guys are focusing on the compost applied.
Yeah, exactly. So in theory, the grant can be used for any services, equipment, labor, supplies, anything necessary to complete the practices that you're awarded for. But having said that, what we are really awarding is the compost application. And so if you have a large equipment purchase that is allowing you to do that, just note that you might be in competition with another applicant who, you know, is applying that compost but doesn't have the same large equipment purchase necessary. So just something to think about. It's definitely eligible, but if that's bringing up your costs too much, then that might make your application a little bit less competitive. So, um, you know, it's all on a case by case basis. I would have to kind of look at what you're applying for, your application, crunch the numbers, and I'm happy to talk with you more as you put together an application. But generally speaking, that's how I'd answer that.
And are these programs only available in California?
Both programs are available in California. Compost Connector is only available in California. Restore is also available in Colorado, Washington, and Oregon.
Um, what is the per foot? So the reimbursement rate for hedgerows, if I understood correctly, you guys don't reimburse like a set rate for certain practices. The applicant bids. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So reimbursement rates are more for other grant programs that are reimbursement based. We are not. So instead, for ours, you tell us what you think it will cost to implement that practice. So that hedgerow, how much do you think it will cost you to do that? And then if you are awarded, you are awarded for the full amount that you bid, and you're paid out in three installments. So the first one is 50% and it's upfront once you sign your contract. The second is 30% once you've started on your practices. And then the final payment is at the end once all practices have been completed.
Indy brings up a point about how many underserved farmers don't own land. If someone is just a uh, or don't have access to land, so that's a broader issue. So if there's not access to land, of course, but if someone doesn't own land, if they're renting land or borrowing land, is there a way to work that
Mhm.
into the application?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, we recognize that not many of or not all of the applicants own their own land. And so you're absolutely able to apply even if you don't own your own land. We just ask that you have your landowner's permission to, be implementing these changes, and provide contact info for the landowner. But yeah, absolutely eligible, even
Awesome.
if you're leasing.
And then you mentioned earlier that while women are categorized as a historically underserved group, they're not a socially advantaged farmer, socially disadvantaged farmer.
Yes, correct. There's two definitions. Historically underserved is broader and incorporates more categories, and socially disadvantaged is more just ethnic and racial categories.
Um, are there any practices on the list for Restore that aren't applied for very often that you wish would be utilized more?
Um, There are definitely practices that are more common. I think we see a lot of applications for compost, but I think that's, a good thing. It's a very beneficial practice, and I know it's costly and needs to be redone a lot. So I think it makes sense that that's one that is commonly applied for funding from a program like this. We also see a good amount for cover cropping, prescribed grazing, um, and then things like conservation cover, and definitely tree and shrub establishments and hedgerows is another commonly funded practice. So yeah, I think there's definitely ones that are less common. But we get, applications for all sorts of practices. And as I said, the practice doesn't really play as much into, how likely you are to get funding. It's more so about your cost efficiency. So yeah, we're kind of agnostic about what you apply for.
Um, for Compost Connector, Abby doesn't have any facilities in her county or in their county. Are there limitations to how much delivery I could be reimbursed for, or are there any options? Just to clarify, I don't think Compost Connector reimburses for delivery. Is that right, Jamie?
Yeah, so Compost Connector is really just based on the amount of compost you purchase. So people often ask, does it include delivery? It is just this rebate amount, a set sort of dollar amount per ton or yard that you've purchased. Sometimes that may cover the delivery costs if the compost doesn't is less than the rebate amount, but there is not specifically funding that goes towards delivery. And unfortunately, if there aren't any facilities in your area, then you wouldn't be able to submit the any invoices from a facility not on our list. You would have to contact a facility to see what their delivery options are. Obviously, keeping in mind that, if you're having to have compost delivered from 100 miles away, it may not be worthwhile for you to use the program based on the rebate rates that we offer.
Can you define the supply chain boost, please?
Yes. So Zero Foodprint, our organization has member businesses that donate a portion of their sales to our grant program. And oftentimes they are food businesses, so restaurants, cafes, bars, things like that. And so it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes farms that apply to our program also sell to one of our business members. And if that's the case, we like to reward that because we're able to show this cool, circularity that the businesses that are donating to us are then helping to fund farms that are then selling back to those businesses. So that's kind of what we're all about, and the kind of food economy that we're trying to create on a larger scale. So whenever we get those stories, we always like to be able to highlight those. But if you don't have, if that doesn't apply to you, don't worry too much about it. It's not a make or break for your application. It just helps if it does apply.
The website says that the application window is closed. Um,
Mhm.
and it's going to reopen in the summer. Indy's concerned because they need to prepare the soil now.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we just had a funding round somewhat recently that just closed. I apologize for the bad timing. But yes, the grant round runs biannually, so twice a year. And so our next one is set to open in July. So I mean, you're welcome to get started on a practice sooner, of course. But yes, we wouldn't be able to start funding practice projects until probably September when you sign when you sign your contract.
And on that, you have, once you apply in July, once it's approved, you have a whole year to do the practice, right?
Exactly. So yeah, you could apply for, your next year's practices. Yeah.
Um, Alex Kuhn is asking, what does the process look like to become an approved vendor for the Compost Connector program?
Yeah, I get this question from time to time. Unfortunately, I don't exactly know the process. It really, so our vendor list comes from that list of Cal Recycle vendors who are permitted or notification status composting operations. So it's really a permitting process that you go through with Cal Recycle. I often, and feel free to email me at compost at zerofoodprint.org. There is like a toolkit Cal Recycle has on their website, and that's generally where I point people to. But unfortunately, I don't actually know the process or timeline for becoming a facility that meets those requirements.
Monica is asking for a clarification question on the compost. The cost per ton is subsidized, but the cost of delivery and spreading is not.
Yeah, so Compost Connector is really just focused on the amount, the quantity of compost purchased, sort of regardless of the cost of the invoice in total. So if you purchased, I use this $10 a ton reimbursement rate because it's pretty easy to do the math. But if you plan to purchase 100 tons and you have this $10 a ton reimbursement rate, regardless of what the compost costs, you're going to get but if you purchase 1,000 tons, then you will get $1,000 rebate. I hope that answers it. But we don't specifically factor in the costs of the compost, the delivery, or the spreading in our rebates. It's really based on the quantity of compost purchased.
So this is just a question that I have because I think we finished all of the questions that people gave us. But do you guys send out alerts when a new rebate credit is available for Compost Connector?
We don't have that set up. It is, something as we're sort of building out. Like I said, we made some changes to the program, so this system is a little bit new. We will, for people who have already signed up or who are about to sign up, we'll be sending out the portal in the next week or so. And then you will be able to see the available funding. We don't currently have an alert set up, but it is something that maybe we might consider doing. Thanks for thinking of that.
That also, thank you for that prompt, Katya, because that reminded me that if you all would like, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we send out infrequent updates around any funding opportunities that we have. So that goes for Compost Connector, Restore, and any other potential funding opportunities that we would have in the future. And we try not to, bombard your inbox with emails. It really is just about like once a month or something when there is news to share.
Can I throw Zero Foodprint's link in the chat?
Cool.
There we go. I think that was all the questions. Guess we can wait if other people want to come through.
Great. Yeah. Also, if anyone would like to share if this was their first time hearing about Zero Foodprint, or if you've heard about us before, that's always interesting to see kind of what touch point we're at with people on these kinds of webinars.
Actually, let me add one more thing. So Angelia at the very beginning said that she was interested in becoming a TAP. Could you,
Mm.
um, are you collecting people's emails to send that out, or is there another way that they can let you know that they're interested?
Yeah, so again, if you want to email at grants@zerofoodprint.org, yeah, happy to talk more about that.
And then we're hearing that Desiree and Joelle both say that this is their first time hearing of Zero Foodprint.
Okay, cool.
And Jenna has known about all the awesome work that we're doing since 2022, or possibly earlier. Can't remember, but Jenna
Thanks,
is
Jenna.
assistance provider.
Great.
Wait, do I like your they look like earmuffs.
Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, also, will the slides be provided?
Well, I believe this whole webinar is going to be recorded and will be on CAF's YouTube channel after. So yes, but also if you would like our slide deck, I'm also happy to email it to you after. Let me know.
Yeah, like Alana said, we're gonna upload the recording in maybe an hour, so you can check on our YouTube channel. I can put the link in the chat just now. It's a playlist for the conference. Um, and we can definitely send the slides. If you want to send them my way, Alana, I can send a follow-up email to all registered
Okay,
attendees.
great.
Um, I think we're ready to wrap a little earlier. If there's no more questions from the audience. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was an amazing workshop. It was really cool to learn about Zero Footprint. And I hope, yeah, people had a good time too. We have another day of workshops and more regional gatherings. You're in 10 different cities all over California, so stay tuned. Thank you.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
one. Bye.